Representative Chris Mathias, how are you, sir?
Matt Todd, it's good to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and he said the next 3 months are the most insane, emotional roller coasters of months. I've never been in politics. I've never followed legislative sessions, like a little bit last year for sure. But this is like the end of the first week already, like, grenades going off, fireworks. It's kind of bonkers already.
It is. Whoever told you that is a liar, though, because it will be 4 months. I think we're going to go till May. I'm pretty fortunate, though, because I get to sleep in my own bed every night. I get to eat dinner with my kids every night. So I have some built-in advantages when it comes to dealing with that stress. So I'm pretty fortunate. So I feel for people from out of town.
Yeah, I actually spoke with Margaret Carmel from Boise Dev a couple months back, and she was talking about how the availability of short-term rentals, because you only need a rental for like 3 or 4 months, right? And the cost of it, because obviously you live like in Coeur d'Alene or something, or Salmon, and you got to come in here and stay for the week, and finding places. And it to me, it was like, do people bunk together? Like, is it essentially like mini frat houses, except you're like responsible adults?
Which is really interesting that you bring that up, because the most interesting aspect of this whole legislator pay bump increase that has gone unaddressed is actually a couple of words in the proposal to the committee, which was, whatever the housing voucher is. But there's no definition of a housing voucher. It's really squishy. And I think if you ask legislators who live outside of the 50-mile radius, I think they would like the legislature to really think about what is the housing voucher by definition, and how do we peg it to the local market rates, because that is a problem they face.
Yeah.
Very real problem they face.
So look, it's the end of the first week. What are things that have come up that you've already kind of like, oh, your spidey sense is going up? Yep. What are things that you're hoping to get after, in this coming time? And again, we can do a dump truck of these. My plan is to be rolling out interviews every single day as things happen. But like, what do we have at the end of the first week?
Yeah. So I think private school choice, private school vouchers, whatever you want to call it, I think is by far the number one issue. It's certainly been the one that the most people are talking about. I'm probably getting the most emails about, at least in advance of session. And it's a really interesting conversation. I try to really come at these issues from a much more kind of policy analysis perspective, which is always, what is the problem we're trying to fix? And I think when you ask legislators, you will find a lot of unanimity on the answer to that question. I think the problem that proponents of, I'm just going to keep calling them vouchers. I think a better term is voucher scheme, because really underlying whatever the scheme is, you're trying to take money from the general fund and you're trying to use it to pay either directly or indirectly private school tuition.
Right. And some people have said, hey, it's not a voucher. It's like, okay, credit, like you're taking public money and putting it into a private system or something like that. And that could be in the way of a tax credit. It could be, okay. So
we'll call it a scheme, a voucher scheme.
Great. And so what do you see as, when you're talking about the underlying issue, like what is it that you think people are trying to resolve? And is first off, do you agree with the problem? And then do you view, if we agreed on the problem, would you view this as the right solution?
The problem that I think I'm trying to fix, that a lot of people are trying to fix, is the outdated and inherently flawed and inequitable manner in which we fund our public schools, which is public school funding is one of the most complicated policy domains in the legislature.
Sure.
But in essence, we maintain a system where the quality of a child's local public school is heavily tied to the value of the home they live in. And this is a national phenomenon. And when you look at it through that lens, I understand why many legislators make this argument that public schools don't work for every kid, and that a lot of kids are trapped because they don't have other choices. And so they're offering voucher schemes as a manner to relieve those kids of feeling trapped and provide educational opportunities to them that they might not have available to them. And I do agree that is a problem. How we fund schools, how many students don't have choices, that is a problem.
But, and again, not a but. it also seems to me to be true that just statewide, you have a huge problem with even availability to private schools. Like if you go to the rural school districts or rural areas, you do not have like an overabundance of available private schools to absorb students, right? Like we have a lot in the Treasure Valley, and that's fine. If people want private choice, that's great. But how would this help for the students that are in the lower, like if you look at the Treasure Valley, you look at West Ada and you look at the Boise School District, first off, you're dealing with some of the better school districts in the entire state, right? Like that's just from a quantitative standpoint, testing the whole thing. These are the better schools. You're also looking at better access to private options if you want them, right? You have an abundance of options. It's like throw a football, somebody's opened up a private school. So you put those two things together, and if we're talking about a voucher system or a modification of the existing public school support system that says, okay, let's increase the number of options people have if they feel trapped at a bad public school. Well, first off, within the Treasure Valley, you have good public schools and you have a lot of private options. If you go outside the Treasure Valley, you have a lower funding, more rural public schools that classically have lower test results, and you also have a lack of private options. So if we're looking at the students that are most at risk in the existing lower end public schools, those areas also coincide with the lowest number of private school options. So if we're trying to address that with a voucher program or a tax relief program or whatever it might be, it seems like it's like, okay, I get the sentiment, but you might be missing the mark because the kids that you're trying to help in these rural areas that some may argue have bad schools, there aren't even private schools to absorb them. Am I getting that? Because that's what somebody told me. I was like, well, that seems like a problem.
You are, but I think we're jumping over a really important step in the heuristics model of policymaking. Talking about a voucher scheme as a response to the problem we just agreed on skips over what I think is the second most important step, which is what are all of our options to fix that problem? A voucher scheme is just one possible fix to that problem. What are other options to address the problem you just outlined? Well, if you ask Superintendent Critchfield, she might say, well, I'm trying to weight how we fund students so that the highest cost students are receiving the most support, so that rural schools or schools that have high levels of special education students or students on IEPs, those are expensive students to educate. We should be giving them a little bit more money than perhaps my kids. So there are lots of options for addressing the problem. But let's talk about the one that's getting the most attention as the fix. Voucher schemes have been around for a long time. In fact, I grew up in northern New England, and I went to high school on maybe the nation's oldest voucher scheme. There were no public high schools anywhere near where I grew up. And there were old private high schools, though. And so the state a long time ago established this private voucher scheme. So I'd be a hypocrite to say voucher schemes are bad. They are not necessarily bad. The question is, are they doing the things they purport to do? And I think if you listen to the governor's state of the state, the governor's theory seems to be, if we're going to have a voucher scheme, if we're going to put public monies on the hook to pay or supplement directly or indirectly private school tuition, they need to be fair. He didn't say what that means.
Right.
When I look at the dictionary, the legal dictionary, is the money going to the people that need it?
Right.
Right? Or are we just going to create a program that allows North End millionaires to be at the front of the line? Which that doesn't seem fair if, again, the problem is to fix what we all agreed on was the problem. I think the governor said it has to be responsible. Is it doing, not just is it doing the things, but are the students who are having access to the money using it in a way that is accountable, which I think is another one of his terms. And then, is it transparent? Do we know how the money is being used? And in instances where there might be potential fraud, do we have a mechanism to audit and find out? These seem like reasonable requirements. Again, if you are going to adopt a voucher scheme to address the problem we all agreed on, then I definitely at least agree with the governor that it needs to be fair and responsible and accountable and transparent.
Right. Because there's no, and this is one thing that I've heard from opponents of a voucher system, which is, you're just going to be giving $5,000 to whoever, and there's no requirements or burdens on it. And then to hear the state of the state where it's like, look, we need accountability. It's like, okay. So that the number one problem that people thought, well, not the number one, but one of, let's say, the top three problems with this was that they thought this money was just going to go away. And we as taxpayers would have no ability to understand where it's going to, who, like how it's getting used, if it's hitting the target or not. But again, in his address, he's like, look, if we're going to do this, it has to be these things. And that was, again, no hard definitions and no policy proposals or nuances there. But at the very least, like, okay, that's good to know that, like, that nobody, or excuse me, at least it sounds like the governor's not interested in backing a voucher system, scheme, whatever. And by the way, scheme, you're not talking like it's a scam. You're just talking like a paradigm,
a mechanism.
Got it. So the voucher scheme in the absence of accountability and responsibility is not something he's looking for.
He said he's not. Whether he's willing to use his red pen on something that comes to his desk that doesn't meet those criteria he outlined is a question that's still open. One of the things that I have found most interesting about this debate about voucher schemes or tax credits or whatever we're talking about is that we think these conversations are about education or only education, and it's actually not true. You know, starting last year, we kept hearing about Arizona. Oh, no, Arizona. And I think a local nonprofit brought the former governor of Arizona, and everything's about Arizona, right? And the people who are opposed to voucher schemes are like, look at Arizona. And the people who are for voucher schemes are like, look at Arizona. And it's confusing.
Right.
So I looked to see what's going on in Arizona. And, you know, a lot of anti-voucher opponents will buckle when I say this, but if you look at the public schools budget in Arizona over the last decade, it's generally remained whole. There might be other things going on in the public schools as a result of their universal ESA program, but it's not the state budget or the state investment in public schools. But if you look at other budgets, what you find, and that jumps out to you and is terrifying to me as someone who's supposed to be a responsible fiscal steward of our state tax dollars, is that the state of Arizona has, in effect, had to cannibalize the rest of the state government to continue to fund their ESA program, which is growing exponentially year over year. If you look at just this year's budget, they had to cancel a $330 million series of essential water projects. And we're talking about Arizona. Water projects are not to be trifled with in Arizona. They had to cancel those. The governor required every state agency to cut its budget 3.5%. Like, we quabble over 1% budget cuts, 2%. Every agency had to cut its budget 3.5%. So what's happening in Arizona is the legislature is cannibalizing other essential infrastructure projects and budgets and agencies to keep the public schools whole. So in Idaho, as we're having this discussion, questions I'm asking are, yes, we don't want to hurt the public schools, but I also don't want to hurt the Department of Transportation.
Right.
And I also don't want to hurt, you know, the water agreement that we just struck is going to require $20 to $40 million a year. That goes out the door if some sort of runaway voucher scheme takes a hold in our budget and there's nothing we do about it. I know I have a colleague who was at a conference a couple months ago, and she said that there were legislators there from Utah, and I think Utah just adopted their voucher scheme last year. She said there were already legislators there talking about legislators who are coming into this session ready to expand it already. So one of the things that I think we need to all admit is that once we have it, it's going to grow. And that growth might be because there's lots of demand and it's proven to be effective and we want to continue to fund it. But I think we all need to be willing to admit that once we have it, it will probably grow. Gotcha.
One question about this. Now let's take West Ada. Okay. I think West Ada spends something like $6,600 a year for each kid. Okay. Now the voucher, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of the voucher is like the money follows the kids, right? So if we spend $6,600 per year already for every West Ada student, and then that kid takes that $6,600 to like a private school. The parents are like, all right, we're pulling you here and we're going to put you in over here. You know, everything else stays the same. Do we really see a net shift in the budget? If it's like, hey, if it was $6,600 here and it's just $6,600 here, like when we say like the budget's going to balloon, it's like balloon for what? Unless you're saying, all right, it's $6,600 in West Ada, but I'm going to give you $10,000 to go over there.
I think reasonable people could disagree on this question. I know, for example, Representative Clow brought an ESA bill last year that essentially kept, 20% of a student's state expenditure with the school if they left the school.
Gotcha.
Out of acknowledgement that schools still have an FTE teacher in a classroom.
Right.
If they have 20 students and one leaves, you still have to pay that teacher. You still have to keep the room hot,
Right.
and cold.
The gym, you have to maintain the gym. If you have 300 kids a day using it, or you have 250 kids a day using it, that cost is amortized. Just, again, it's a fixed cost. It's not a sliding scale.
Right.
Like, oh, we went from 300 meals to 250 meals, so we're buying less flour and less beef. Like, no. It's a fixed cost.
It's a fixed cost. And acknowledging these realities doesn't make someone a liberal or a conservative. These are just cool heads trying to work through pretty heady issues. And so Representative Clow, he acknowledged, like, yeah, you still have these fixed costs you have to address. So he proposed, let's keep some of the money in the school. I think, over the course of the session, we're definitely going to see a number of proposals. I'm really interested to see, what kind of ideas people have. Some of them we've heard about a lot. I'm really interested to see if some new ideas come forward. But again, the ideas I'm looking for are ideas that are directly mapped to the problem we're trying to fix, which is there are students for whom the public school system does not work particularly well, but because the value of their home and their neighbors' homes isn't high, their public schools might not have what they need, and they don't have any other choices, especially if they live in rural districts where there just are really no private school options.
Gotcha. So this is going to be one that it seems like there are going to be a lot of bills coming down, a lot of things happening. What else? What else have you seen this first week, or what else are you anticipating in the coming weeks?
Well, just yesterday in Judiciary and Rules Committee, Representative Marco Erickson introduced a bill that he's been working on for years. There's a lot of stakeholder support, and it's called essentially the Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management Model. The problem it's trying to fix is that if you have a student who demonstrates concerning behavior, you want to make sure that you've assessed whether that behavior is indicative of some sort of threat that can be identified and addressed and prevented, right? Big school districts like you talked about, where the local home values are high and they have plenty of resources, right, they have behavioral threat specialists. Either that's their whole job or it's one of their collateral duties. They have people who are trained and designed using best practices to assess these types of behaviors. But rural districts, small districts, poor districts do not. And what's happening is they don't know what the best practices are. And even if they did, they don't have the capacity to implement them. And so what this behavioral threat assessment model, the BTAM legislation, will do is set kind of, these are the state's minimum expectations for how you assess these types of threats and respond to them. And if you do that and something happens subsequently, if there's an act of targeted violence subsequently, but you did everything that was expected of you, we will not hold you liable. We will protect you legally so that you cannot be sued. And Representative Erickson said yesterday during the hearing, there are school districts that have been in litigation for years about this. And I think, his interest, his prosecutor in his county at the time, Mark Taylor, in the wake of the Rigby shooting, they realized that there really needed to be some sort of state level minimum on, like, how do we expect schools to respond to, potentially threatening behaviors.
And this idea of, you engage in this set of practices, you engage in it in good faith and thoroughly and conclusively, and then we will protect you, or you will be exempt from liability or something like that. That has precedence in a lot of different areas. I mean, you see it in, weather programs, you see it in, like if somebody builds a house next to me and they get a permit and they go to the city, like, I can't just try to sue them to oblivion. They're like, we're following all of the rules. Like, we're not breaking, so the idea that we have a checks and balance, so it's not this unlimited, for instance, paycheck, where if something, and God forbid, like, nobody's worried about the money in the presence of a tragedy, but people do look to the legal system for justice, or at least what they feel is justice. So it's interesting to hear that it's like, no. If we can establish something that you engage in these things, not only do we anticipate that you will have a positive influence, right? You can identify disturbing behavior and ward off potential threats in a preventative manner before they even become, the action threats. Not only can you do that, but we're going to stand behind you, but you got to do these things.
Correct. And let's come back to schools for a second. But before we do, you might have remembered the governor this summer mentioned that he'd been working with the utility companies and the firefighting companies to figure out how to address the same phenomenon, but in an entirely separate domain. That is, if utility companies are doing what they're supposed to do to keep their equipment safe, up to date, replaced, and there is a fire that is caused by one of their utilities, should we hold them liable if they did everything that is expected? And what we realize is there isn't actually kind of a statutorily set minimum level of expectations. And so I haven't seen it, but I do know a bill is coming to address the same phenomena, but in the space of utility-caused fires. If utilities are doing the things we expect them to do to maintain their infrastructure and keep it safe and updated, and there's a fire that was caused by some of their equipment, do we want to hold them liable for that? And again, reasonable people will disagree, but I think it's important to have these conversations about making sure that people who are on the front lines of doing things that are essential to society, essential to Idaho, are protected when they've done everything they can do.
Right. I appreciate that you keep saying reasonable people will disagree, because I think there finally is a wave of people saying, hey man, it's not working to just be hyper polarized and like hyper one-sided. Like I can be very passionate about, going one way or another way. It doesn't matter to me. But to say like, I know that there's a counterpoint that is a reasonable person. We don't agree. We think that, philosophically, whatever it might be, but just like, hey, these are not bad people. They're reasonable. So it's, in all our conversations, I appreciate, I don't think I've ever heard you say that. So like, that's fantastic. We need to popularize this idea.
Yeah. Well, not only popularize it, but I think understand what it means. I mean, anyone who's been to law school has been in the conversations where students are introduced to the legal concept of the reasonable person standard. And naturally, if you're introduced to the standard for the first time, you got a lot of questions. Like, that seems a pretty subjective standard,
right?
Reasonable people, what does that mean? And actually, I just wrote an email yesterday in which I separated the two words. I think it's really important to start separating the two words. To reason, able. Is someone able to reason? Is someone able to explain how they arrived at the conclusion they did? And is the evidence they cited meritorious? And do you think that they analyzed it individually and in the aggregate in a way that makes sense? Right. So I have people that I disagree with all the time, but they are reasonable. I understand all the information they consumed. I understand how our values or our political philosophies change how we analyze things. But there are people who say things, and I'm not sure they are reasonable. I'm not sure that they've consumed all of the relevant information, synthesized it, and drew a conclusion that was the natural, outcome of that analysis.
Yeah, sure. Or just hold up against the most basic pushback. Like, listen, I'm not attacking you. I'm just wondering, like, where did you get this information? And if they fall apart in first, kind of analysis, it's like, all right, well, like, no sweat. It's not, I don't have a problem if you have this position. It's clear that like this position is not really one that we could even bring to the forefront. Because whenever you go into like the marketplace of ideas, man, you better get ready to beat up. So
you have to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to come back to school safety, I think, again, what is the problem we're trying to fix, right? Well, I think we have to start by asking, what are the things that are making schools unsafe? I think there are a few. I'm probably missing some, but off the top of my head, I think mental health challenges are very, very real. I think a lot of kids, and to be honest, probably many of their parents have real mental health challenges that are going unaddressed. And for those that want to address them, it's not as easy as I think we would hope. There are not enough healthcare providers, mental health care providers. Paying for it is not always right. It's not always covered by insurance. So I think the mental health situation is very real in our schools. That's making schools unsafe. I think cell phones are making our schools unsafe. Not just the anxiety and depression that social media apps on phones are causing for our students, but also the role that the video camera on phones is playing in bullying incidents and really making them, much more attractive to certain age groups. I think that's a problem in making schools unsafe. Harassment, intimidation, and bullying generally, I think, is making schools unsafe, especially if you ask, for example, Black families in West Ada who have been having these conversations with that school district for years now. A lot of the families are like, we hear what you're saying, but our kids don't feel safe. This is what's happening to them, and we don't feel enough is being done. That needs to be done. And then I think there's also some underlying housekeeping things. For example, a bill I've been working on this summer that I will run this year. You wouldn't think it if you were reading state code, but there is a section in state code that says school districts have the authority to deny enrollment or to to
Expel or exclude?
Yeah, expel. Excuse me. I was going to say kick a kid out of school.
Yeah.
If they meet these criteria. One of those criteria is, the student was punished or expelled or something like that. The receiving school district, if that kid tries to transfer to another school district, they can say, oh, you were expelled. And maybe we don't want to let you in if you did something dangerous. But what a lot of parents have learned under the current statutory regime that we have in place is that if their kid is about to be punished or held accountable for doing something dangerous, they're just withdrawing the kid from school before that punishment and expulsion goes on the record. And so the receiving school district that this kid is applying to enroll in either doesn't know that they were about to be punished for doing something dangerous, or they're not permitted to take that into consideration. And so this bill that I've been working on with all of the key stakeholders is, how do we address that phenomenon? How do we acknowledge the fact that kids are about to be punished, but they were disenrolled right before that happened? How do we measure that, and can we take that in consideration? So I think there's a lot of smaller housekeeping issues that can also be addressed to keep schools safe. But again, there's no silver bullet to fixing this problem, just silver buckshot. Lots of little things are going to need to be done to make our schools safer, and it's going to require all of us to kind of be on the same page about what the problems are we're trying to fix.
Great on all of those. And again, specifically with the cell phone, the tech security issues are very near and dear to my heart. I had a vice principal from Valley View School District, vice principal come in, and we had a conversation. That episode went out yesterday or the day before. Alan Dade. And Alan Dade was in the service. I believe he was in the Marines. He's also been in education for, I think, like a decade and a half on the teaching end and then on the administration end. And he has been saying that although there is this national, state, and local movement to start restricting cell phone access, to start, minimizing the damage cell phones are doing on school. And again, let's be clear, that's a personal tech device, right? Because it's not just a phone. Like we're essentially saying, hey, you can't bring your own personal computer in here, right? That fits in your pocket. He said he spends roughly 40% of his entire day dealing with problems with school administered tech. And that's something that, overwhelmingly West Ada put a cell phone policy in place, and, Governor Little did things, did a thing with cell phones a couple months back. So it's like everybody's focused on the cell phones. But in Alan's, the vice principal's experience, he's like, listen, we take their phone away and then hand them this Chromebook that they pop open. And he said he's had, in his experiences, he's literally had people walk out of classes because they didn't have they forgot the Chromebook in the locker. He's like, you don't need your Chromebook. We're doing pen and paper today. We're not even opening the Chromebooks. And the kids go AWOL. And he's a really big dude. He's like, listen, classroom management has never been a problem for me. He's a big dude, ex-Marine. And he's like, these kids will full on defy you just to be next to their Chromebook. And that seems to me to be the next recognition where it's like, okay, if we acknowledge cell phones are a problem, but even if we take away cell phones, students still have access to technology. They still have access to information about how to get around protective mechanisms. Another thing he said that a student did, because I had mentioned how, we have these guardian programs and monitoring programs. And he said there was a kid in the Valley View School District that knew workarounds to all these things. And he started a Google Classroom, and the entire district signed up for this is a student for his Google Classroom, where he demonstrated, taught everybody how to get around all these monitoring devices off of school tech. So he's using the school tech to show everybody else how to jailbreak their school tech in effect. And again, tech seems to be the thing. We all talk about cell phones, but there's this bigger wave of okay, even if we remove cell phones, they have the exact same technology with school administered tech.
Yeah. You can't disagree with that. Not only does that tech, I think it's important to back up. Our educators, they want to, as much as possible, try to replicate the real world so that learning is happening in context. And there's tech in the real world. So,
and if I may say something really fast,
please.
Every school district I've talked to acknowledges, they're like, listen, we go to work every day to solve these problems. We're working on it. So it's not like Alan was not coming to me saying nobody cares. I believe educators and the administrators and the systems in place are like, look, we really are trying to get this done. These are problems. We all got this tech dumped on us over the last several years. And, there are some benefits to it. And and reasonable people may disagree, but there are a lot of people that are saying, hey, there are benefits to this, and we're trying to iron out these problems. And it's just understanding where the ripples are to iron out. That's a big piece, but people are working towards it. Like, it's not like the school districts are negligent or just intentionally trying to, insert problems.
And while, I think we're getting clearer on what the full list of benefits are to the thing we were discussing earlier, I'm not 100% sure we're clear on what the full list of costs are. Child predation. Do parents know what's inside the tech that schools are administering? I mean, there's all kinds of issues that I know people smarter than me on this topic have been working on. So I agree. Tech is an issue. Access to tech, the role that it plays in the educational process is an issue. And all of these things, back to the main topic, is to some extent they are making schools less safe, or I should say they're making it harder for teachers to keep their classrooms safe.
Yeah. I know this is a working day. You stepped out right after the floor. I hope we continue to have these conversations, because again, I'm 2 blocks away from the Capitol for this. And shout out to the state PTA. This is their office, and they support conversations about education. And I made it very clear to them when they offered me the space. I said, hey, look, I very much enjoyed my conversation with Senator Den Hartog, and she's very much for the voucher program. And I've also had Senator Nichols in, and very much enjoyed talking to her. Like Speaker of the House Moyle, like, these are people that are working for things that you might have counter positions to. So you have to understand this space is going to be about, a lot of things and both sides of the education conversation. And the state PTA was totally on board with that. So shout out to them for providing this, because I couldn't afford a studio downtown.
Thank you, Idaho PTA.
Thank you, Idaho PTA. Is there anything you'd like to say at the end here, Representative Mathias?
Have a great weekend. I'll see you next time soon, I hope.
I can't wait. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, you bet.